I'm going to start off with 3 components around selection committees, EDI statements, the survey, because I'll ask you to think of additional domains we may want to add to this January's survey. You don't have to have all the answers tonight, but if you think of them after the meeting, you can email me later. And then I'll be really excited to introduce Madeline's new initiative on an allyship program that we're hoping many people from the EDI Advisory Committee and our newly minted EDI champions may want to sign up for, because it sounds really exciting. I think I participated in the pilot of that program, first pilot, and it's a great program because many of you might be coming to this committee or now be labeled the EDI champion and think, oh, I don't know everything about EDI and people are going to ask me questions and I don't have the content area. And I'll just start off by saying you're not alone. None of us is an expert in all aspects that could be covered in EDI, and most of us are self-taught, I would say. In the case of Madeline and Will, certainly I just read and learn as I go. And creating this position in the Department of Medicine, I think, came out of a sense of need, some observations of inequities, and the incoming chair, Mark Crowther, was open to create this position so that we could do better in some areas and innovate and measure how well we're doing. So it's been 4 years now, and I'm happy to say that across the Faculty of Health Sciences there are equivalent positions that have sprung up in pediatrics, psychiatry, and even at the Faculty of Health Sciences level there's a very large EDI advisory committee. So keep in mind, if you'd like to get experience being on the FHS committee, let me know and I'll connect you to the right people. That's a great committee because I think your allyship connections may be started there. There's it's co-chaired by Bernice Downey, so there's a large component of Indigenous reconciliation on that committee and always interesting discussions. And that FHS Central has just completed the selection process for I think Associate Dean Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, who will start on February 1st. Have they made the formal announcement? Has anyone seen it? So the incumbent is a really skilled individual, and it's exciting that she'll be starting. So lots happening and lots to learn. And why we thought having an equity champion in each division was important is there's so much activity in our department. So many new recruits, so many leadership positions up, and often I would be asked to sit on the committee and I couldn't be on all of them. I'd ask Madeline or Will, and we've all had our share of different committees, but if each division had their own 1, 2, or 3 champions, I think it will be less work for some, and also it will help us have better conversations and dialogue around equity and diversity. And I think the processes we're starting to put in place will become more understandable to more people. So we'll start off. These are the components of tonight that we'll review, as I mentioned. And so I'll just start off with a couple slides before we get into the meat of what we call the equity checklist. So, here we have a picture of a kind of traditional selection committee, and even today, less so, but sometimes I'm on selection committees and they still look relatively monoculture, but certainly back in 2018, when we started this initiative, what was very common in our department is you may or may not be asked to be on a selection committee. You wondered how it was that someone became a leader. There was no real process. We just received notices of appointment. And if you were on a selection committee, they're often quite homogeneous in terms of who was around the table. And that was one component. Committee, no process, lack of committee diversity, and then it was seemingly fairly biased because rather than having criteria, a scoring sheet, a discussion, and potentially blinded voting and a democratic, the majority wins, it was often more of a conversation amongst like-minded people, and you'd often hear, so-and-so's not the right fit for this position, or not ready for such a role is a common refrain, and I don't know how she could manage this, she has kids, and so maybe we'll wait till her kids are older, and then, so you'd hear those types of comments, and in some ways, sometimes they're referred to as doubt-raising, so individuals will make a judgment about somebody else's ability, or their time management, or their skill set based on personal interactions, as opposed to a less biased viewpoint of the candidate. So we tried to bring in more candidate diversity, committee diversity, and then if you see our equity checklist, we're now on version 2.0, we ask that the chair of the committee has unconscious bias training. And unconscious bias training, Will could debate me here and he could give a whole hour of why that doesn't work that well, but we can come to that. It is a fairly standard component of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, because at the very least it helps the chair and sometimes committee members be aware of their own biases, because we all have biases depending on who our parents were, how we were raised, what communities we lived in, and by doing unconscious bias training, you kind of understand where your blind spots may be, and you may actually not blurt out a comment, you might think it but not say it, and it may help committee decorum somewhat. So, a classic picture I like to show is oftentimes we talk about unconscious bias training, and doing like a Harvard implicit bias test will tell you how you may be biased, but unconscious bias training alone won't fix some of our systemic biases that lead to similar leaders being chosen over and over again. And this is a nice visual example of how a structural change can sometimes de-bias a system more than trying to get individuals to think differently. And this is, they did notice that all the principal violinists of the orchestras in the United States were men. And, does anyone play an instrument here? I bet we're just playing like yeah, so I remember going up for auditions for orchestra and band, and there are three adjudicators there in front of you, and I played the drums. You know that, so you'd play, and it's kind of like they would probably say back in rural Nova Scotia, here we have a woman, South Asian woman, applying for percussion, she's not the right fit, right? So in the US, there were no principal violinists who were women. So they put in this curtain process for the auditions, and the adjudicators only listened to the music. And all of a sudden, there are more women principal violinists. So it's an example of how you can change some of the structures in place to decrease biases. So what do we do in the Department of Medicine? And what goes into choosing what we say the best candidate? So we've, our goal is to come up with what we think is reasonable and makes sense, measure how we're doing, and if it works, keep it in. If it could be better, we can tweak it. So we're now on to Equity Checklist 2.0. So for the equity champions and division directors here, if you're planning to recruit new faculty, or you're creating an associate division director position, for example, then following the equity checklist is strongly recommended / mandatory in our department. And basically, if we focused on new recruit, you have to make sure your hospital partner, someone like Madeline or Khalid, does the hospital impact analysis. You have to work on your posting for the position using inclusive language, and there's the right things to say and the wrong things to say. So Lori Rurink in our department can help with putting together those advertisements. We do have in the checklist now, choose at least one associate chair. So if you're recruiting a researcher, you might choose Jeff White's because he's the associate chair of research. Education position, Amin. Sometimes I can double on the research and the equity champion. So I've been on committees before. And when we first started this, our kind of biggest, most glaring bias in terms of leadership positions was a gender bias. So we built in at least 30% of the committee should be women. Now when we get to equity checklist 3.0, we'll add in the diversity based on ethno-racial identity and maybe some others. So at least 30% women. And the posting, that's pretty short, 2 weeks. For the university positions, it's often 2 months. And a barrier to creating a diverse candidate pool is sometimes our rush to just get somebody in. So Lori can post it on a number of different places, but if you really want a diverse candidate pool, having the posting up longer and calling people across the country to say we have this position coming up. So I think the department's a lot better now. If you're trying to get someone in for July 1st, you have to start latest January. So it can't be a June plan for a July 1st start. That won't go. So what does that change? It changes the way we used to do things here, which, sometimes it's reasonable, sometimes it's not, which is, I've worked with this clinical scholar for 2 years. You promise them a job, so that happened in my 25 years here. You said you will be starting, and that was really the process. Now we shouldn't do that, and the reason why that's not always a good thing is we usually tend to select people just like ourselves. So there's this concept of institutional reproduction, like we just keep, choosing similar people to us, and that leads to potential limited diversity, could lead to groupthink around certain issues. So if you've ever looked at U of T's processes, they're much more stringent than ours, and they actually on their website say like we're trying to overcome institutional reproduction. They never promise a job to an up-and-coming faculty. So start early, try and get a diverse candidate pool, and then the chair of the selection committees, typically the division director, should do the unconscious bias training module. Christine, you've probably done it. Tim, have you done it yet? Yeah. Jim?
Not yet.
Yeah, so in the equity, you just started. I'll point Jim all the time. So in the guidance document are some recommended sites. Typically, maximum it would take is 1 hour, and you get a CME credit if that is meaningful to you. And so then you have an idea of unconscious biases. Then meet with your committee. It could be over a teleconference to come up with like who are we looking for, what types of questions should we ask, and we like to be as quantitative as possible. So score those responses on a Likert scale, 1 to 5, and then we also require that candidates write an equity, diversity, inclusion statement. This is a new addition on the equity checklist 2.0. Is everyone familiar with EDI statements these days? Yeah, they're pretty common. And it's been quite an interesting journey with these. So some candidates write like 1 or 2 pages, their lived experience, their clinical experience, what they want to do in the research, and a fulsome description. Some candidates have called me or the chair or Annette and said, like, do I have to write anything? I'm not an equity group. And so that's telling in and of itself. And we say, yes, everyone should, consider their position in this department and how they'll relate and manage some of the challenges they'll face. So it's a good learning exercise for everyone, no matter, what their identity and identity characteristics. So this will just demonstrate all of those components. Oh, sorry, question.
I just wanted to ask about the EDI statement. So just being on a few committees, like you mentioned, there's a lot of variation in what's submitted. Is there any appetite or thought to provide a little bit of kind of
You set me up
She
for this
planted-
question.
you planted this question in excitement.
And Adan's about to jump up and say, that's my research project. Yeah, so that's part two.
Okay.
Because of that wide variability, and we really noted that people reviewing the statements, there was huge variability in people's assessment. So Madeline might score it a 5 out of 5, and the next person a 1 out of 5, the same statement. So why is that? So Adan spent a lot of time developing a rubric that we're testing. Hopefully be good to go. Yeah?
On your last slide, Sonia, if you could go back, I did this process for 2 faculty hires not that a year and a half or so ago, and it's relatively straightforward. It's easy to do, but you run into some barriers relatively quickly in trying to set the process up. And I find, like for myself, with a university division, a Department of Medicine division, and I collaborate with a hospital department, and critical care is a department unto itself at the hospital, which is multidisciplinary in nature, so it's surgical and anesthesia, just the same as medicine. And in terms of going through this, you know, if I'm going to be looking at a research scientist, I would immediately think of Jeff. So I've got one man for the committee already. I look at the hospital chief, who is very demanding of wanting to be on that committee to hire, because usually it's they're hired just the same as the university, so it's yet another man. And then depending on which unit that a person may work in, because all of our units are run by a man, it's yet another man. So I'm already lined up with 3 men. And so trying to reconcile getting myself to 30% of diversity.
It's hard.
It's
Cardiology
really
has the same
hard.
problem. GI has the same
Right.
problem because
So-
they're 80-20, men to
So
women.
how do we reconcile
Same people
that?
are-
Because you don't want to have the same people, but sometimes you feel handcuffed with some people that there's a necessity from a perception of necessity that they have to be there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
Then I feel like I have to be
We
there
actually
because I'm
don't
not-
have that guideline.
Another man.
We don't have that as something that's mandatory for you, Tim. There are some components. But yet you probably want to be respectful. If these folks are saying, I want to be on the committee, it means you'll probably have to increase the number of people on your committee so that particular group, so your ratio works out. And then you have some other type of diversity. And that's a challenge also when it comes to the discussion, because we'll go through it, but we typically ask the most junior person around the Zoom or the table to give their comments first, because if the chair went and then 3 of those men you described, then by the time you get to the resident, they would be like, I agree with everyone else, right? They wouldn't speak up against like that
I just had that
group.
experience where I took part in a meeting with very senior people to me, and the most junior people did not get a chance to speak because the most senior men went first, and so the folks at the table who would have had the most diverse representation and opinions that would be valuable from a lens like this never got a chance to provide their opinion in a unbiased or in an uninfluenced fashion.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the guideline, and having this discussion is really important, because then when you're doing it, you'll call on the resident first, and you go around in that way. Sometimes when we get to the older ones, we can't tell who's really older, so you might be off a little bit. Could go by gray hair or not, something like that. And then everyone says their piece, and the other key point is the voting is blinded, because in the olden days, which was only 5 years ago, it was a hand. And so then you must be talking about the hospital, because that's not ours. Yeah, and they're way behind.
With our process is so much.
Yeah, that's HHS, I assume.
You're right.
They have a ways to go. Joanne.
I was just going to say, because, as a new recruit that's gone through this process and jumped all these hurdles and done the checklist, I think that part of the problem is that we live through EDI, both policy, procedure, and an experience. But the challenge is, as Tim rightfully pointed out, what about the hierarchy that already exists and dealing with the issue? Like on your next next slide.
Yep.
Dr. Anand. You have that leadership positions don't need an EDI statement. I disagree. You're
Yes,
asking
but-
your new faculty to do all of these things, and the people who are going to leadership positions or in leadership positions
Yeah.
should be made to do the same. Because I think part of the problem that we're, facing, and, I'm very lucky because I have Tim who actually really believes in EDI, but there are still people
Yeah.
in 2021, when I had to go talk to the gazillion people you have to talk to get heard, where they were saying appalling things to me. So in those positions, those people should be made to do the exact same thing.
And I think we are doing that now. That was when I first put the slide on. Yeah, but 3.0, we'll put it there. And that's a great point, Joanna. And also when we do the EDI rubric, sometimes people will say, well, then people will game the system because they'll look at your rubric. We will make that available. And they may not kind of believe it or act it, but they can write a nice statement. Well, that happens in life. Like, I don't know that we can
The MMI does
change that.
too.
Yeah.
But I do think there needs to be something, I think, we've done great focus on the new hires.
Yeah.
But that's not addressing the generational issues that
Yeah.
exist within the hierarchy of, I work at HHS, so I can tell you
Yeah.
exactly exist in HHS, and also the university.
Yeah, it is challenging, and there is an age kind of effect, and like I see it in the residents and the youth of today. Like, they will definitely be less patient with these types of comments that the older guard has endured. So there is this clash in the hierarchy, older faculty who wield a lot of power, and the up and coming. I don't know, Will, if you have any comments. If you have any comments on the old guard, or Madeline, if an EDI statement would change them, again, I think it's performatory often. Like, what do I need to do to get the job? But when they're in the job, are they acting it out? Not often. So then what? It's like the leader has to step in. And so that's the chair of the department, the chief of the hospital. That's what we see. And in some divisions that happens, in others it doesn't. And then problems where it doesn't just fester and get worse and worse and worse until there's a big explosion. It is happening in a number of divisions right now.
And I think it's true that there are people that are against EDI.
Oh, yeah.
They're ideological.
Oh, yes.
Well, one really senior person has told some others, this EDI thing will blow over soon. Like, that's his impression. Yeah. Eslam.
Just wondering, do you think adding non-division member to the committee would help? Maybe if they don't have enough members in the division to keep the gender equity, or at the same time to avoid maybe part of the subconscious bias of the division members. So adding non-division
Yeah.
member, maybe from the same department or maybe from other department that we work closely.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We face it in cardiology a lot. There's 80% men, 20% women, and then it's the same women on all the selection committees, right? So that's hard to do. Plus, it's complex too, because you may have certain relationships with folks in research, etc. So I think bringing in someone who works with the division or will be working in the same clinic, something like that, is a good idea. Yeah. Okay, so this is what the checklist looks like. It's on our webpage, Department of Medicine EDI webpage. You go through it as the chair, and you have to fill it out and submit it to Lori Ruring. Why? Because at the end of each year, I look at all of them, and we do some analyses, see how well we're doing. You have to do your unconscious bias module, list of applicants for the position. That's another area where things are getting better, but in the olden days, we'd either have just one person, 2 people, 3. I just heard for a GI position, was pleasantly surprised that there were 8 applicants. So that's the kind of number we'd love to start seeing. And that's the list of applicants is often called the long list, and then the committee can decide, again, who they're looking for, have a rubric if you want to go from a long list to a short list. And then the short list candidates you list and you interview them. The standardized list of questions, Annette has a question bank. You could use that bank and then modify it. The EDI statement, we're soon going to, I hope, after you get ethics approval finally, we'll have a rubric to help score it. And then you submit everything, the vote count, any issues that came up on the committee. We've had some challenges along the way. One example and one recommendation is if there's any concern about any candidate with a professional who has a professionalism problem, the chair of the committee should discuss that with the chair of medicine to decide if the individual should go forward. Because it's very difficult for a selection committee to start making judgments about professionalism issues if they're just starting down a process, if they're not resolved, etc. So that's an ongoing discussion, but the best is if you, as chair of a selection committee, have a professionalism concern about somebody who's applied for your position, you should speak to the chair for internal candidates, not for external. You probably wouldn't know about them. So creating a diverse candidate pool, what we've learned in the department is if you're thinking for an internal position, a leadership position, start tapping people on the shoulder. It doesn't mean the people you tap on the shoulder will get the position, and you should be really clear about that. But tapping people on the shoulder helps individuals overcome what's called imposter syndrome. So some people have all of the credentials but feel that they may not, have enough. Women seem to have more imposter syndrome than men, but it's can occur in anyone. And what we found in the Department of Medicine is nudging people or tapping people on the shoulder a few years before the position comes available is the optimal. A few months can be challenging, and some won't agree to throw their hat in the ring. Well, you've had a lot of experience with that when we did our cardiology search. I think you were on the phone encouraging a number of people, right? Yeah. Tim?
Is there any processes within our Department of Medicine for, a position when it's maybe 2 years out, it's going to come to, that we can have notices sent out to remind, our different divisions and groups about opportunities and the potential to now start tapping people for, committee leads?
Yeah, I think, Tim, by virtue of the fact that you're on the Council of Medicine, you would be hearing that at every meeting. Like Mark just did the vice chairs, and he had on, he wants to change associate chairs to vice chairs, and he had on each one the terms. So, for example, Jeff White's is retiring from his position at the end of June. So, okay, vice chair of research is coming up.
But we're talking 6 months from now.
Yeah,
Whereas that
2
2-year
years.
lead time, or, I might have a good relationship with an endocrinologist who's in, early half of career that might have great leadership potential that you might want to, because there might be other people in other groups that we might want to nudge to seek out opportunity because of some experience we've had with them, because I won't know what's going on.
Yeah, I can mention that to Mark, even if on a web page or something, we could have the term appointments, because term limits never used to exist, but now they exist, and they're really important to enable people to move up.
Yeah, similar to how they do make sometimes for boards of directors, right?
Yeah, that's right.
NGOs and that kind of thing, where they'll post it up.
Yeah, so maybe we can do that on our webpage. It's a good idea.
Question about, with the term limits, in some roles, the person that has that position right now is functioning quite well. They're interested in renewing, the program department office is interested in renewing that. And so putting out a call to say this term is ending might seem odd unless we're moving towards that person competes for that again.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So division directors are typically 2 5-year terms. So I get it that, if someone's doing really well, there's no point in putting out that the first 5-year term's coming to an end because there's a high likelihood that if they're doing well, they'll be renewed. The university in the Faculty of Health Sciences has this interesting procedure where there are selection committees convened at every 5-year term, even though it's kind of a shoe-in that the person. So, have you been on some, Madeline? I've been on some where it's called like the selection committee for Paul O'Byrne, and so then it just kind of raises all these flags. Is Paul not going to run for the second 5-year? And then you get there and like, no, he is. But we all just sit there, we listen, and we say, okay. I guess that's part of the university policy. So
Not for division directors, though.
not for division directors. It's more a chair dependent, but it's a good suggestion. We could build in something around that. So
Then there's a situation where they're not
yes.
functioning well, but if it's pre-assumed that they're gonna have two functions.
Now there are more, like in the olden days, again, I'll just say olden days, 5 years ago, there were no kind of expectations written down for division directors. It's like, now you're the division director. But now there are lists of things. I think, Jim, did you get a letter that says your expectations?
Yeah, it was still way too brief.
Yeah.
It was way too, it was a lot.
We can make it more
It would be
intense.
nice for it to be way more explicit,
Mhm.
because, but it's still relatively limited.
Mhm.
Let's risk that someone could pull something out of the air, so we'll get to, right?
Mhm.
So,
Okay, so sometimes, you know, a barrier to getting a diverse candidate pool is the rush. I've already mentioned that. So planning ahead is really important, and not everyone understands that. So sometimes as the equity champion, you can bring that up. Do you know a barrier to getting a diverse pool is trying to rush a process? And sometimes there's a reason for the rush, like someone just quit and you need a new interventional cardiologist. Other times there's not as much a rush, so you should take time. Okay, so, Will, do you want to briefly talk about Daphne?
Sure, I mean, Daphne, it sort of gets to like what we talked about in that picture you showed.
Yeah, unconscious
Violinist,
bias,
right?
yeah.
It's, the literature's quite clear that unconscious bias training doesn't really work. And so it's just, what's your other strategy, right? Can we put up a barrier so people can't see the difference, whether they're male, female, or ethnicity, what have you, just who's the best violinist. And so DAPNA is just basically a game theory application of selection process where, you know, you get a diverse group, you get incentivized to have a larger selection committee, which is more diverse, you get disincentivized otherwise. I think that has driven a lot of some of, you know, people having bigger selection committee. I know that's a bit of the process. And then, you know, the thing that you realize when you come to that, and this happened most recently, Paul O'Byrne is used to running small groups and we would always come to consensus, and he expected consensus, and you realize when you have a table of 20 and they're all from different places and different perspectives, it's going to be a lot more chaotic and you're going to be a lot less likely to come to a consensus. And then, so what's your process for that, and really what's your fallback? And you have to either build that consensus or you go to a randomization, because you're basically committee is saying we can't tell who is
The better candidate.
and so we should just randomly select, and everybody hates that, and everybody always like just like I've gotten hate mail about that. And even though, you know, when we don't know when treatment works, when we do a randomized clinical trial, when we do anything, it's like it's the most humble and
Unbiased.
humility
Yeah.
thing to say. We just don't know, and let's select it. But I think the flip side of that too is when you have a diverse group and it's really chaotic, and this just happened to us as well. We said, well, let's take a blind vote, and it's like 80% pick this one, and you can have a lot of assurance in that, right? I mean, it's the opposite of group thing. You
Yeah.
have a diverse group. That is really what the wisdom of crowds is. When we talk about the wisdom of crowds, it's a diverse group of people, and yet for whatever reason, they all agree
Yeah.
that this is the best candidate. So
Yeah.
that's it.
I think you're right. Like, Will pilot tested, I guess, 4 selection committees, and we
Yeah.
published
Well, a couple
a
more now.
paper, where we piloted it, and it's a real innovation in the space because most EDI initiatives are just unconscious bias training. But what we've seen since we started the Daphne, I think, to your point, Will, is if you have a diverse selection committee, you're doing really well. And I've seen many selection committees go extremely well with the kind of steps I described. diverse candidate pool, diverse selection committee, the junior to senior comments, and the blinded voting. Most committees have gone really well, and we haven't had, the committee fall apart, which we have in some circumstances. And the times where we did, Tim, was when we had a voting block of the people you described endorsing one candidate, and people in a division who work day to day in that division supporting another candidate. So the voting block was really, well, if I look on paper, or this person's a right fit for the way we think, we've had this schism, and we've had a dead heat 50-50 voting block of senior leaders and divisional members. And then we put it to the chair to say, you've heard everything, you have to cast the kind of winning vote. Yeah, that was tense. And so this was done for another reason, but really, I find in the past we used to rush through our selection committee. People would show up at the selection committee having not read the dossiers of the candidates, having not read the EDI statement. So I would have you emphasize to your selection committees to read the materials before they come, and meet once over a teleconference or a Zoom to really articulate who you're looking for in your leader or your new faculty, so people are clear and they're not just rushing in and not preparing and then being unhappy with the final selection. Try and involve your committee and get them to put in work and time. We're trying to this year pilot EDI contributions on the AFP forms. So it's a pilot to see how well it works, but we should be rewarding all of you who give of your time in this space for your contribution. So I think you'll start to see that more and more. The way you score things, we leave it up to you. You could say the personal statement written by the candidates counts for the same amount as past track record of leadership potential, all of these types of domains. And you can also choose to weight some questions more than others. And I think, Christine, you've done some weighting, and we leave that to you, and you can always consult in if you want. Okay, so this would be an example of your scoring sheet. Why are you interested in joining the division of X? The weight is, whatever the score is, it's weighted as the score, a Likert scale, and then these are the rest of the questions, and you can end up with a total score. If you have 4 candidates, what's really good with the system that Loshana can describe for you is your teams are all there with the rubric in real time, scoring the candidates, and when you've interviewed all the candidates, we automatically calculate the mean and you show it back to your group. Candidate A's score was 10 out of 10, candidate B was 8.5. Like, you can put it there. Then everyone says, oh, is that how you choose by a score? And I say no, it just shows how we felt before the discussion. Then after the discussion, you can choose to rank candidates in a different way. Maybe you've learned something new about them. So I might go more quickly over how to set up a scoring rubric, but a lot of people ask these questions to me, and I always refer them to, it used to be Graham, and then Graham went to RMA, competing for a meeting time tonight. Graham was great with his Perry portal. He used to set it up. But then he left, and we kind of had Annette showing people how to use SharePoint, and Loshana learned how to do it, right? Is this SharePoint?
No, this is a different system.
What is the system? Excel?
Microsoft Forms.
Microsoft Forms. Have people used that before?
Google Forms.
Okay, some forms. And here are some slides, and Loshana promises me it's easy.
It's easy.
It's
very
easy and real time. Okay, so how to set up the scoring rubric. Like, you could all take these, and if you have some administrative help, ask them to set it up for you, right? And you've shown some people, and it's really easy. And how to collect and send responses, really easy. And then you get something at the end like 5 questions, average score, and you can get all the metrics you want, like which question did most candidates do well on, and which ones did they do poorly on. I mentioned about the voting. So it's really important to discuss with your committee before you embark into the process how it's going to work. Like, are we looking for consensus? Like Will said, Paula Byrne used to say everyone should agree. More and more, we're not seeing that. Is it a democracy? So if we have 11 people on the committee, you need 6 to win, right? 6 yeses. Or is there another threshold that the committee wants to set? Like you need to reach at least 9 votes out of 11 to really come up with the best candidate. And Will has a whole algorithm if you want to really go out there and potentially randomize. Daphne is a possibility too. And Will and I have done a podcast. There's the paper. If anyone wants to see the paper, we can send you a copy, and it kind of goes through all the steps of this. So when we get to the survey, I just want to make a plug for the survey. Not only does the survey tell us about who we are as a department, it also has led to a couple of publications. So we'll use some of the data of who we are as a department for the background of his paper. And Steph Garner recently published a paper on burnout of our faculty after COVID. So there are lots of opportunities for people to use these data for research. Okay, so then I'll just spend a brief moment to talk about this concept that we're starting to use for promotion and tenure. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's more the opt-out of being considered for promotion and tenure. So you know how, again, in some systems for awards, we haven't changed it for awards, but for awards or for going for leadership, we leave it to individuals to decide, yeah, I'll throw my hat in the ring or not. But there was a really well done randomized trial by some researchers at U of T where because women are less likely to self-promote, either for promotion, tenure, leadership, or awards, they look to see who's eligible and qualified for whatever position it is, and you are put into a pool, and you're asked to take yourself out of the pool if you don't want to be considered. And that leads to more equity in terms of, certainly gender equity. And so we've started this. This is the reference to the study. It was randomized, so everyone's happy. We've started to do this for promotion and tenure because what we saw is at the associate to full professor level, more men were putting their selves or applying for promotion, and a lot more women were saying, like, I don't really see the value of doing it. It's a lot of work, but what will it really get me? So we've started to do this, and some division directors weren't happy. I'll just look at the division directors because they said, well, like, kind of that common thing, like, we can kind of recognize who deserves it and who doesn't, but there can be biases of the division directors towards some people and not others. They might be looking for, like, who they think is in the full professor mold. So this is something we give advance notice to people who are eligible to apply for promotion, and we have had more people do so.
Sonia, just
Yeah.
quick question. I actually like the process because it triggers the discussion with the division member, and at the minimum you can have the conversation. Right? I can't remember the last time around. I think it was the division member coming to me. They have received an email, but I wasn't made aware.
Yeah. So we're.
So I think
Yeah.
both people should know about it because
Yeah.
then you can connect and have the conversation.
And that was another division director had the same issue, that in his mind the person wasn't the type of person he'd suggest should go for promotion, but they got the email and came to him and he wasn't aware. So we're trying to make sure that we get to you at the same time. Yeah. So how are we doing time? What time is that? 8:05. So the next part I'll go through really quickly so you don't lose steam to hear from Madeline. It's around the EDI statements, and this is Adan and her work, and we have an EDI research group within Faculty of Health Sciences. Sandra's on it, Will's on it, Madeline's on it. Derek, are you on it? I can't remember.
Express interest.
You've expressed
Yeah.
interest, okay.
Happy to help.
Okay.
Outright.
Yep, you're welcome to. Anyone's welcome. There's no limit. But I know we're all busy. And Lisa Schwartz from HEI's on it, Natasha Johnson, Saru Sharda, a number of us are on this, trying to bring some, I guess, standardization to how we assess EDI statements. And Anand made these slides, so thank you. So what we had observed was that the scoring of EDI statements were all over the map. We observed that in the Canada Research Chair Program, and we observed that in our own department. So we started on developing a rubric and testing it, and Adan's been leading it, and soon we'll get REB. So to put the rubric together, we did the usual scan of the literature, and I think it was the Berkeley EDI rubric that you used, and then we tweaked it after some, pilot testing of it. Adan made up some sample EDI statements like the type we would usually see in the Department of Medicine, and then we tweaked some of the domains. And recently, was it 9 of us reviewed 4 of your sample statements, and we had a high level of agreement. So the intra-class correlation was quite high, and these are the types of domains. I think you can see competency, knowledge of EDI. So the positionality would be, even if you're, a white male, you can position yourself in the changing world and say you recognize, X, Y, Z. So positionality has a domain, teaching, research, community involvement, future plans, and then interest in learning more in the area. Those are all the domains we have included. And then the scoring is actually on a 10-point scale as opposed to the 5-point scale. And as I mentioned, we've actually had a fairly high level of agreement. This is an example. It might be for sure too small, but the way it was nice in the pilot because it's a lot to remember as a reviewer to score, but we have it such that you're scoring the statement on your, I think we used a red cap survey, but you can also easily check back at the descriptors that go with the score. So we'll just have to figure out a way, because not everyone would use red cap necessarily in our department. We'll have to figure out a way so that once we've finished the testing and we make it available to you, it will be straightforward. So the data analysis, the bottom line is across the 5 statements, 9 reviewers, we had a really high level of agreement. 0.96 for level of agreement is really good. And now we recognize that we're probably a very selected group. So let's imagine you had people who weren't really endorsing EDI as part of the group. They may have different scores. However, it's a rubric, there's a statement, there's, it's fairly straightforward. So that's that, and we have a few other steps. We're waiting for high rev approval to then use real statements with our set of reviewers. We have anonymized real statements from Medicine, and the Canada Research Chair Program will retest the rubric, and if it works well there, then we'll be able to share it with you. So before I go to Madeline, I just wanted to put a plug in for the survey that we put together and administer every second January. So this will be the 3rd administration in January 2023. When we had a call with the EDI advisory group probably a month and a half ago, these were some of the domains that other members of this committee had suggested we make sure to add. So you can see them post-COVID condition. Do you, as faculty members, if you had COVID, do you have any long-term symptoms? Burnout, we would ask that again. We've asked it every year, and it was quite high. I think it was close to, was it 69% of our, was it? 75, I always underestimate, but high, of our faculty reported burnout during the COVID pandemic. And it was high to start with, and COVID pushed it even higher.
It was something like 60% in 2019 that reported some level of burnout, and then 75% of people
these are suggestions from other individuals. We have always had like who we are demographically. We've always had questions about professionalism. And if you can think of any other domains, please send them my way. I'm interested in moral injury as something we could ask individuals about. I also was thinking about adding some questions on what department members, what their perceptions are about EDI initiatives. Like we could put something together like that. Any other ideas for the survey?
So that's really great that you're looking at who we are, but has anyone looked into because if you're trying to increase the diversity, has anyone looked into how much people feel that they belong?
Yeah, an inclusion question. Yeah.
And how much people feel that they don't have to change themselves to feel that they belong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Has anyone looked into
I don't think we've asked that, but an inclusion question, for sure we should. We've done that in another survey I'm involved with. So that's a good one.
But
that change yourself is really good.
It's different than inclusion, right? It's like feeling like you're in the right place, that you're part of this.
There are well-validated surveys about this. One is the working group inclusion scale, and the other is the perceived group inclusion scale. And they look at these two, and these are validated.
Do you have them
I can send
at your fingertips?
Yes,
if you could send them to me.
I do. I have to tell you that they're pretty long.
Yeah, that's a problem for us.
That's the problem, but they are, and they are validated.
But that's a really
will send those
interesting.
out.
Yeah, Joanne.
Just two ideas. One is 2 years. Every 2 years, enough time elapsed to see a difference, and also just being mindful of one of your questions is about burnout. So we see this a lot in research about just survey burnout.
Yeah.
Right? I think I got like 6 surveys today to fill out across my disciplines. I just wonder, we update guidelines every 3 to 5 years. You want to see change. The other thing I was wondering that creating a safe form of evaluation is for candidates that interview for those jobs. I think there should be a mechanism to feed back the interview process that it's anonymous.
Yeah.
And a third question is when you do your, collect all this data, analysis of the data, do you actually formulate recommendations for change from this data, or are you more just looking at trends?
What data? The survey data?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do. Like for example, we've created infographics as we've gone on the different domains of the survey. And one, question that we've asked every year is, have you witnessed or experienced unprofessional behavior? And it's about 35 to 40% of faculty members have witnessed or experienced. And then we go on to ask, are you aware of the policies to report? If you've reported, what was the outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And what we saw is there was almost 40% of our faculty didn't know that policies existed. And another percent didn't think it would make a difference or change anything if they reported. So from that, then we tried to raise awareness about the policy and process by sending it out to all the faculty members with the infographic. And we're trying to change the culture. I mean, it takes a lot.
To do, like to take this data, because you're building on a research program as well as trying to change culture, but actually to do some sort of interventional study in addition to supplying people with resources, because I think there's, because I have friends who work at UT and other universities across Canada, and as much as people say they lead EDI and they have this very strict criteria, it hasn't changed any culture. So it makes me wonder if there could be an actual intervention.
Yeah,
and another just to that
so
point.
do it. If you suggest it, do it.
I'm happy to be a methods person for y'all, but I study the gut.
See, and I'm less research, I'm more kind of action oriented, but where it's been helpful is being able to break it down by division or break it down
Yeah.
by various demographic things.
Yeah.
And so then you can start to pick up on trends and end up kind of getting a little bit of an
You can look at
info
hot spots.
heat map, yeah.
Yeah,
of
we've
where-
done that. You're right,
Exactly.
Madeline, for you, for a few things. And we've also, because we have divisions, right, reported, we've broken it down by divisions. And when we're trying to recruit a new division director, or when we're doing an external review of the division, we give the external reviewers information and say, like, these might be some potential hot spots. But
I'm certainly happy to analyze the drinking patterns of people who have burnout. It's a big issue.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
no, but all that to be said, being serious, that, I mean, some of us are researchers in other domains and take this on. I respect that you have a lot going on, but if anyone has an idea, we'll be really supportive. Sandra, you do a lot in that area, so like.
Yeah, it's difficult to comment on because it's in development, so I can speak a little bit to some development around the professionalism standards and some of what you were describing as tensions between, might be tensions between age groups, so, you know,
Yep.
residents that might be less patient and older clinicians. All of those things create tensions in the workplace, and we've got even worse kind of factors contributing to that sense of burnout. So, like I am working with Mark Rather and Leslie Martin to think of some things that we can implement. So it's less of a research program and more of a translation. But one challenge that I imagine has been a barrier to people implementing policies and their consequences is the diversity of the workplace that you all work in. So you have you report to an education program, you report to the hospital, and there's your hiring policies, and then you report to your professional standards like CPSO and World College, and all of them have different carrots and sticks, let's say. So you can get in trouble with one, but continue to operate in every other domain. And so to a faculty member, it really does look like, what does it matter if I complain?
Yeah.
Because nothing's going to happen to you, because you're free to continue to work professionally. And so those are things people are having conversations about. U of T has been a little bit further along, at least at the policy level, to try to align what the hospital's going to do about it, who's going to report to CPSO, and you know, for those really egregious situations.
We have the Hamilton Spectator that, that brings to our attention that we didn't know about some faculty members, and nor did the CPSO. Right, so.
But I think that part of the challenges I find is that, you know, there is a little bit of lip service that's happened with EDI, and as a woman physician and scientist across organization, not just here. And I think part of the challenge is that we report all this information and you do have the resources, but, you know, I guess we're getting, I'm not that far away from the older men, but there's this lack of meaningful intervention to actually change the game. Because I can tell you at U of T, yes, they have all these great policies, but they're not implemented.
However, I hear you, like between policy and change, like we need the cultural change, right?
Actually, there's a disconnect that's happening.
But the literature would say the best and fastest way to change the culture is change who's at the top. To your point, right? That you could have all the policies in the world, but if you had Donald Trump as your leader, nothing's going to change, right? But if you diversify the leaders and they have the lived experience of, you know, different groups, things will change faster. That's certainly been shown in the United States around getting more black individuals into leadership. Once, you know, they have diversity committees, they had Deloitte come in, very expensive, and there was no diversification of the workforce until people at top levels were those demographics, and then the change started to happen. So, don't give up. I see some positive change.
To your point,